Welcome to Cultural Caravans. I'm Dr. William Seraile, your host for today's program. My guest is Dr. Gerald Horne, professor at the University of History. He is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies. We're going to discuss his latest book, Confronting Black Jacobins, which is about the Haitian Revolution, Dominican Republic, and the United States. Now, in 1938, C.L.R. James wrote a book called The Black Jacobins. Does your book differ from that in any large area or not?
Well, yeah, it does differ. C.L.R. James's book, his book mostly deals with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, whereas my book deals, number one, with the U.S. role in the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, and then takes the story up to 1870, 1871, when the United States sought to annex the entire island of Hispaniola and deport a significant percentage of the U.S. Negro population, so-called, there. So it was sort of a very curious end to these revolutionary events. Although I should say rather quickly that part of the thesis of this book is that you cannot even begin to understand how slavery was abolished on the North American mainland, that is to say in places like New York City in the first place, not to mention places like the Carolinas, Georgia, Louisiana, etc., without understanding the Haitian Revolution. My thesis fundamentally is that the Haitian Revolution helped to ignite a general crisis of the entire system of slavery in the hemisphere. And that crisis can only be resolved with the collapse of the system, which of course ensued circa 1865 on the North American mainland. You may recall that in a book I wrote a few years ago, it talked about the role of British abolitionism in bringing an end to slavery in North America. And so in some ways, what I'm trying to do is decenter the United States or Washington, or even Euro-Americans for that matter, in terms of understanding how slavery collapsed, and trying, in this book in particular, to highlight the role of Haiti, which suggests that we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Haiti for being on the front line and taking the arrows in the chest, not least so that we could be liberated, but also that people throughout the hemisphere could be liberated.
Well, actually, it's kind of ironical, as you know, that the Haitian Revolution overthrowing French control allowed the United States to expand. Because once France lost all that territory in Haiti, they had no need for what became known as Louisiana Purchase.
It's a very curious story. I also talk about the fact that, well, you know, in my previous book on 1776, I talked about the role of France in allying with the rebels led by George Washington and the other slaveholders to overthrow British rule in North America. And as a result of that alliance between these North American rebels and Paris, you had these North Americans who were past masters at slave trading, slave smuggling, slave dealing, taking on the role of being a major deliverer of enslaved Africans to the island of Hispaniola. And what that does is create a demographic imbalance. That is to say, the Africans are so outnumbering the Europeans on the island of Hispaniola that it creates this fuel for slave revolt. Then is ignited in August 1791. You may know that U.S. slave dealers had a major role in the Hispaniola economy. In the book, I talk at length about U.S. slave dealers and slave owners in Hispaniola, in what we now call Haiti, being expropriated, being beaten, being killed, because part of the impact of the Haitian Revolution on North American slavery is that you had thousands of slave owners who were arriving bedraggled and thirsty and hungry and famished into Savannah, into Charleston, into Norfolk, bringing tales of woe about Africans on the warpath. This ignites anxiety on the part of people in the United States, helps to provide a negative attitude towards Hispaniola. It also causes the U.S. slave owners to dig in their heels, because they feel that if they don't dig in their heels with regard to slavery, they'll face the same fate. Whereas one of the ways my book differs with C.L.R. James's book, I think takes the traditional point of view which tends to see the revolt of 1776 as something positive. Of course, I take a different point of view. And in James's book, perhaps understandably, given that he at the time was a so-called British subject, he's very hostile to London. Whereas in my book, I talk about how London tried to intervene in Hispaniola to overthrow the revolutionary regime led by Toussaint Louverture, and suffered one of the most ignominious defeats in British colonial imperial history. And then, unlike the United States, which dug in its heels at the prospect and the reality of slave revolt, London flipped because, of course, it was easier for London to flip because there weren't necessarily all these slaves on the banks of the Thames like there were on the banks of the Potomac, for example. And in any case, London had a fear that its slave owners, the British slave owners in Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Kitts, Barbados, etc., weren't necessarily patriotic. They might want to cut a deal with the United States and have their own 1776, rebel, and enter the Federal Union in what is now Washington, and thereby get the protective cloak of the United States. In other words, stab London in the back, just like the rebels on the North American mainland stabbed London in the back. So London had an interest in pulling the rug out ultimately from its slave owners. And so what happens after the Haitian Revolution is successful in 1804 is that you see, in many ways, this relationship that develops between British abolitionists and Haitian abolitionists, both of whom are targeting the United States of America. The targeting takes many different forms. For example, we're going to be talking, as many have in recent days and weeks, about Charleston. Well, as you probably know, the Denmark-Vesey slave revolt, which in many ways was plotted at the Mother AME Emanuel Church, that was just the target of this assassin, Dylan Roof, so-called, in June 2015. That, in many ways, was the place where that plot was hatched. Denmark-Vesey, who was a seafarer and had sailed in and out of Haiti, supposedly was conspiring to do a mass jailbreak to take valuables from Charleston and then sail away in a mass escape to Haiti. If you look at a lot of the slave revolts that take place, either abortive or actualized in the hemisphere in the first few decades of the 19th century, they have Haitian fingerprints all over them, including the Nat Turner slave revolt in Virginia, Southampton, Virginia, circa 1831. Interestingly enough, one of the first academic studies to examine the Nat Turner slave revolt done by a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore suggests that a number of the Africans with Nat Turner had actually been brought to the North American mainland by slave owners fleeing the Haitian Revolution, and that some of those who were targeted to be slain in Virginia were also refugees, if you like, from Hispaniola. But that's more dramatic evidence. I think the more objective evidence with regard to Haiti's role is not only in terms of what you were just suggesting, in terms of with Napoleon's losses in Hispaniola, Napoleon's alleged claim to the Louisiana Territory, because obviously it was Native American territory that Napoleon and the U.S. administration were squabbling over. But after that defeat, there was less of a reason to hold on to it, which then leads to this deal with Washington, with the United States, I should say, leading to the so-called Louisiana Purchase, which of course expands exponentially the territory that the United States controls.
And ironically, helps to spread slavery too.
And helps to spread slavery too.
I want to shift a little bit here. Mm-hmm. This relationship with the United States and Haiti, because in 1859, the president of Haiti offered to, what he said, Negroes, mulattoes, and American Indians opportunity to come to Haiti as agriculturalists. He said we could domicile 50,000 people. So you had this Haitian Immigration Bureau led by Scotsman James Redpath, who had agents here in Canada to recruit. Now, approximately about 2,500 took the journey to Haiti for a new life. You want to expand upon that, or expand maybe more generally about this sort of conflict, contradictory relationship between the United States and Haiti? Because it wasn't until 1864 the United States recognized Haiti and mainly because the southern states, the Confederate states, weren't in Congress to say no?
Well, from the earliest days of the Haitian Republic, there was outreach to the population then known as U.S. Negroes on the North American mainland. In fact, Dessalines, an early leader of the Haitian Republic, as early as the first few years of the first decade of the 19th century, was offering to sponsor and subsidize the migration of the people we now refer to as African Americans to Hispaniola. This takes off in the 1820s under Jean Boyer, who you may recall that the Haitian Revolution basically winds up controlling the western side of the island. The eastern side of the island is controlled by Spain. What happens in 1822 is that the weakened Spanish monarchy is basically chased out of the eastern part of the island, and the island is united under Haitian revolutionary rule. Many of those slave owners wind up flocking to the North American mainland, particularly to New Orleans, and the regime in Haiti feels the need to have allies on the eastern side of the island. So they make an appeal to black people in North America to come to Puerto Plata on the northern side of the island and what is now the Dominican Republic, and to Samaná on the northern side of the island, which is now part of the Dominican Republic. It's estimated that thousands heeded that call and kept coming in the 1820s, the 1830s, and the 1840s. You may know that in 1844, and as I point out in the book, not least because of covert intervention by U.S. Secretary of State John C. Calhoun, of course, of South Carolina, slave owner, theoretician of slavery, a secessionist movement develops on the eastern side of the island, which succeeds and leads to the formation of the Dominican Republic. Their formation is February 1844. That's when they celebrate their national holiday. But this leads to dramatic conflict between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Warfare that stretches on for years, stretches on to the point that in 1860 approximately, in a remarkable episode in world history, the Dominicans invite the Spanish to come back as their colonizers. I mean, usually when colonizers come into a country, they come uninvited, like these British and other Europeans came to the North American mainland. They didn't ask for an invitation, they just bogarted, as they say. But in the DR, they asked for the Spanish to come back, which they did. But there's dissent and discord within the DR with regard to that. So the conflict just ensues and continues. In the midst of all this, the Haitian regime, as your comment suggests, needs bolstering and buttressing. So it makes a call, once again, for black Americans to come to the island. And of course, they respond in significant numbers. But of course, what's happening in the 1860s is that the South, the Dixiecrats, the slave owners, attempt to overthrow the U.S. government, a fact conveniently forgotten today, because now, ironically, they style themselves as the staunchest patriots, even though they're there to overthrow the government in Washington, and establish the Confederate States of America throughout this land so that they could perpetuate slavery forevermore. And so what happens is that many black people feel that they should stay and fight the slave owners and not abandon, so to speak, their brothers and sisters who are on the North American mainland, and that curtails the flow to Hispaniola. And as it turns out, of course, the slave owners were defeated. But interestingly enough, what happens after that is that the U.S. administration gets this idea that if slavery was the problem and the black people were the slaves, well, then you get rid of the problem by getting rid of the black people. That's not a new idea, in fact. As a matter of fact, you have a lot of, quote, historians, unquote, who talk about what I call fake abolitionism during the so-called Revolutionary War after 1776, whereby certain northern states supposedly become abolitionists. But actually what they're trying to do is saying, get rid of the Negroes. Now, if you call that abolition, well, so be it. I don't call that abolition. I call that expulsion and deportation. And certainly that was the idea after the U.S. Civil War. That is to say, for the United States to take over the island of Hispaniola, because the DR is weakened. It's weaker than Haiti at that point by an order of magnitude. And then deport the U.S. Negroes, particularly to the eastern side of the island, but also to, as U.S. Grant, the president after Andrew Johnson, suggested that even though the original idea was just to annex the DR, the ultimate idea was to annex the entire island, overthrow the Haitian revolutionary leadership, send all the U.S. Negroes there. Voila, no more so-called Negro problem or Negro question. And you may know that this is nothing new. I mean, if I may digress for a moment, it'll only take a minute. You know, I wrote this book some years ago, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. It tells the story about how after the U.S. Civil War, the U.S. slave dealers, they took the keep sweat position with regard to slavery, make it last forever. So they began moving from the North American mainland to the South Seas, enslaving and enchaining Melanesians and Polynesians. Melanesians look like yourself and myself, dark skin, same hair, etc. The Kingdom of Hawaii interposes itself to try to object because they're being sent to Fiji and to Queensland, Australia. And what happens, of course, is that the U.S. objects, and ultimately the Kingdom of Hawaii is overthrown. And then in 1959, it enters the Federal Union. In 1961, the U.S. President Barack Obama was born there. At least Donald Trump doesn't agree, but that's what the records show. But what's interesting is that Australia, like the United States, after all these Melanesians and Polynesians have been brought to Queensland, they looked at U.S. history, said, you know, these dark-skinned people, they create too many problems. So they had a mass expulsion of the dark skin, including some of the indigenous inhabitants, who of course have been living there for thousands of years. So there's something of a precedent about expelling the Negroes. And then, you know, the historians, you know, one definition of historians, they're the ones who come on the battlefield and shoot the wounded. Well, that's what they've been doing to us. I mean, they come and clean up the mess by basically exacerbating the original harm by calling expulsion abolition or progressive.
Yeah. I just want to shift a little bit. This may be outside your area of research, but I've heard you know, commentary that Haiti is suffering so much today because they broke away from French rule, and therefore Europe punished Haiti by, you know, economic issues, financial issues. You think this is credible or not?
Well, Haiti is suffering not least because it had to pay reparations to France. And in fact, there have been credible allegations that Jean-Paul Aristide, the Haitian leader of some years ago, that he got into hot water on the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution in 2004 by stating vigorously that he thought that there was something objectionable about the slaves, the former slaves, paying reparations to the former slave owners. In fact, you can make an argument, and I do in the book, that the wealth of New Orleans, which before the Civil War had more millionaires per capita than any place in the United States, was due in no small part to the fact that the French slave owners were fleeing to New Orleans from Hispaniola. The Haitians then were paying reparations to Paris, and then the money was being sent to the French slave owners. It's a very curious episode. So I think that's what wounded Haiti, was having to pay these millions and millions and millions of dollars reparations. Secondly, there are historians today who argue that what happened in Haiti to the French was a Caribbean genocide, not unlike what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, what happened in Cambodia in the late 1970s, what happened in Rwanda in 1994. Now, I don't accept that point of view, but the fact that historians who are presumably credible are making that argument today, in 2015, suggests the dramatic impact of the Haitian Revolution, because the slave owners were faced with a stark choice: either retreat and give up slavery, or lose your property and your life. And that's not a choice that they welcomed. Well, the largest slave conspiracy in North American history takes place in Louisiana in circa 1811, led by Africans who had roots in Hispaniola. Also, you should know that the French Protestants, the French Huguenots, of course, they're expelled from France hundreds of years ago. France is a predominantly Catholic country now. Many of them migrate to South Africa, where they merge with the Dutch population. You find many French names to this day amongst the European minority in South Africa. But many of them come to the United States. And they take to slave dealing and slave trading, as I say in the book, like whales to water. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that in South Carolina, that French in certain coastal regions is spoken more than English because of the presence of these French folk from Hispaniola, the French Huguenot population that's fleeing from France.
Okay, well, we have kind of running out of time here, which is unfortunate. But I have a question that probably is on the minds of a lot of the audience members, and that is, what's the historical background between Haiti and Dominican Republic in terms of the hostility shown towards Haitians today?
Well, it's a long, complex story. Let me begin to scratch the surface.
Okay, within 3 minutes.
Well, the short answer I've already alluded to, which is the fact that the U.S. helps to engineer the secession of the DR from Haiti circa 1844. This is in the context of a battle within Haiti that takes on overtones of color that, of course, is encoded with class. And what happens is that the DR is one of the few countries on planet Earth that was born in a revolt against a predominantly black country. And that has helped to create a culture whereby in the DR, there's let us say, an extreme sensitivity to color. And that helps to shed light on the fact, while as we speak, you're seeing a hunting down of dark-skinned people in the DR who are alleged to be Haitian, even though they may have roots in the DR stretching back scores of years, because dark-skinned people are presumed to be Haitian people. And that's, you may know the story of Sammy Sosa, the Dominican ball player, the slugger, who of course, yes, had performance-enhancing drugs. But the performance-enhancing drugs apparently didn't lighten his skin. It was a conscious attempt by him to strip himself and denude himself of his melanin. That is the reigning metaphor, it seems to me, of the DR and their relationship to color. And what's happening, of course, is really a violation of international law. The hand of the DR regime has been stayed to a degree because of the protests at the consulates in New York, the consulates in Los Angeles, the embassy in Washington. But we know that in the 1930s, DR dictator Rafael Trujillo actually massacred thousands of Haitians in a similar context. And I think if we are to prevent that tragedy from recurring, we must step up our protests against what's happening as we speak in the Dominican Republic.
So do you have any final 30 seconds comment?
Well, let's see. Only that I think, once again, to reiterate, we owe the Haitians a debt of gratitude for being in the front lines in the struggle against slavery. Their successful revolution ignited a general crisis of the slave system that led to the collapse of slavery on the North American mainland as well. And so we can never do enough to repay that debt, that enormous debt that we owe to Haiti.
Okay, thank you again.
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people, because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve, and so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, you know, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until time they make the transition to the grand ancestral ground.